The sky didn't bend like fabric, it bent like memory. At the ragged edge of the heliopause, stars seemed to ripple, and night itself folded into a tight fist. A brute geometry pushed through, faceted hulls that caught no sunlight and yet glowed with their own cold purpose. The Cynosure Dominion had arrived. High Marshal Kersh Tal watched from a throne of obsidian steel as the fleet's shadow spilled across his displays. His species, the Vekri, had perfected conquest by mathematics. Quantify fear, schedule submission, amortize rebellion. He did not speak of war as glory, he spoke of it as logistics. The third planet ahead was blue, green, and guilty of naivete. Humans, fragmented polity, redundant ideologies, millions of languages if you counted the ways they argued the same things. He felt an old, familiar certainty settle into the bones under his carapace. Another ledger would close. Perimeter shows no coherent exo-armor. Intoned strategos mare. Orbital lanes cluttered by civilian tin cans. No fortresses, no shields. Their largest platform is barely a warehouse. Approach slow, Tal said. Slow is kindness. Slow lets them understand what's about to happen. On the blue world, 1,000 unrelated lives went on without knowing their sky had been weighed and priced. In the snow-baffled ranges of Colorado, where maps used to go blank, a mountain hummed to life. Director Samuel Reed swiped past a dozen confirmation panels and keyed the interlock he'd rehearsed in nightmares and classrooms. This is North Star Command. Condition amber everywhere. Activate Choir handshake. Bring QuietNet online. QuietNet was what the public never knew they paid for, a synchronized mesh that braided quantum pairs seeded across the inner system. It did not carry words as radio did, it carried intent. For 60 years, small committees with boring names had prepared for an event they refused to name Apocalypse. They called it the Harbor Doctrine instead, an unromantic idea that harbors did not start fights, but they were built to end storms. Captain Alina Morales floated at a workstation on Orbital Guard Station Aegis, once an old palace of experiments, and now the anchor point of a secret chorus. She was calm in that practiced way of people who had burned their fear in training. Copy North Star, she said. Choir pings green across 39 nodes, civ-orbit assets in place. ROE remains harbor. Affirmative, Reed replied. We will not fire first. We will not flinch either. Morales looked through the viewport at the awkward, beautiful planet that paid her salary in breath. She thought of a high school civics teacher who told her that law was what you could live with the day after you won. Military doctrine had its own phrasing. Win fast, win clean, win so clearly that others never make you do it twice. The first tight beam contact from the Dominion was contempt in grammar. Unknown system. You orbit a resource sphere designated 3 Sol. You will cease transmissions, disable propulsion, and prepare for abduction processing. Acknowledge within your smaller unit of time, 10 minutes. They knew only enough to misname everything. Morales didn't answer yet. She nodded to her comms officer. Mark the clock. The station's air seemed to hold its breath as if oxygen had a conscience. Across oceans and borders, people who had promised to be boring forever were suddenly very interesting. The quiet facilities, ice quarry-looking things in the Kuiper Belt, irradiated warehouses tucked under Maria on the moon's far side. A string of weather satellites, too consistent for weather, spoke to one another as if they'd rehearsed a ballet, because they had. Reed's chief ethicist, Dr. Amina Varzi, stood at his shoulder with coffee she didn't drink. Keep the pre-authorization package visible, said quietly. We communicate our law before our force. It won't matter to them, but it will matter to us after. After matters, Reed said. He turned to the wall where the charter for extraterrestrial contact hung in a frame. There were only 4 lines that mattered under the emergency lamp glow. We do not fire first. We do not fire second without warning. We strike to end. We hold to law when the law cannot hold us. Back aboard the Dominion flagship, Kersh Tal allowed himself the luxury of prediction. 10 minutes of human noise. 10 minutes of bargaining, offers of gold for air, of tribute paid in songs. He had seen a dozen species try to buy delay. Delay had a way of turning into funerals. "Acknowledge transmission?" asked Stratego's mare. "In 8 of their minutes," Tal said, "and let indifference be theater." Aegis received the second Dominion ping at the 8-minute mark, a cruelty of courtesy. Morales opened the channel. The camera painted her as small against a wall of moving maps, the same trick every captain made when they wanted the other side to understand the thing behind the person. "This is Captain Alina Morales of Orbital Guard Station Aegis," she said. "You have entered a sovereign system without consent. You issued a demand inconsistent with any law we recognize. The harbor doctrine applies. Withdraw and you will be treated as ships lost and found. Persist and you accept responsibility for what follows. We will not fire first. We will not surrender." There was a pause long enough to hear someone on Earth cry out inside a kitchen that the television could not help. Then a voice like a blade carried across vacuum. "We do not recognize your doctrine," said Tal, "but we recognize your time. 2 minutes remain." Morales muted the line and looked at the timer. The numbers weren't ominous, they were just honest. "Weapons safe everywhere," she said into the choir. "And hold your breath for me." It is fashionable to pretend that history pivots with speeches. It more often pivots with logistics. In tunnels where Ferrocrete sealed out geology, keys turned in pairs. In an Antarctic cavern disguised by albedo and indifference, a rack of cylinders cooled to a patience older than anger. On the far side of the moon, a mass driver alleged to move regolith into orbit for industry, aligned with something that would never be in a brochure. The timer struck 0 and did not change the physics of anything. But somewhere very far out where the night is mostly rock, a Vecri gunner drew a finger over a firing paddle and added heat to the universe. The Dominion fired first, and down every corridor where the charter hung, a quiet promise woke. The first Dominion beam arrived like a scar trying to draw itself across the sky. It was beautiful in a sterile way, white-hot plasma threshed by magnets, a civilized torch with indecent appetite. It journeyed toward continents that had named themselves after old explorers and older myths. Its light did not reach the ground. The harbor doctrine did not begin with gunfire. It began with a warning encoded into every band the Dominion was listening to, and a few they would learn to respect. It was recorded a generation ago by a woman no one remembered until her face appeared on every panel. "This is the human charter's notice of imminent defense," her voice said, plain as teacher's chalk. "You have initiated force. We will now end it. Cease fire, shut down drives, and depart along your incoming vector. You have 30 heartbeats to comply. It is not kindness to count for an enemy, it is discipline." In the 30th heartbeat, Aegis went from a research station's self-image to a harbor's purpose. Quiet Net sang. The choir mapped 306 targets and began to think in harmonies. "Confirm ROE," Morales said, needing to hear the ritual more than the words. "Harbor holds," Director Reed answered. "Strike to disable when possible, kill when necessary, collateral under 1%. Make it less." "We'll try," Reed said. "We always try." In the old archives, Morales had studied wars that burned longer than love. She'd learned that restraint did not mean softness. It meant competence under a leash. She had read of generals who had quoted Augustine and engineers who had quoted cost-benefit analysis. She favored neither when the timer hit 30 heartbeats. She favored the doctrine that taught her to save civilians, enemy, and her own by ending decisions fast. A ring of what the Dominion had called civilian tin cans lifted their faces. They were satellites that had once passed weather to farmers and discounts to phones. They exposed snouts like fluted organ pipes, and the fluted organ pipes spat metal at an argument the way a court spits truth at a lie. The kinetic darts, crowbars rifled to within a fraction of a human hair, left their muzzles and became something closer to law than to projectiles. They didn't glow. They didn't hiss. They arrived. A Vecri cruiser bloomed oddly as if a magician had removed its middle. A transport unzipped down a seam its designers had never drawn. Shields swelled like righteousness and then did what righteousness does under reality. They failed under the one trick they had never bothered to respect, mass at speed. Stratego's mere hiss clicked. Unknown kinetics, non-thermal, sublight but too fast for our gating. Their stones go through our light. Displace, Tal commanded. Expand the lattice, present angles. Angles did not save the next 6 ships. You can be clever about geometry and still lose to a civilization that trained children to calculate lead on baseballs and then applied the principle to the vacuum between worlds. Lunar driver awake, the choir murmured across Morale's board. Stoneflower bases listening. Stoneflower was a lie humans told rocks to make them kind. The asteroid facilities opened like patient seed pods. Within their bellies, missiles that had lived their whole lives nameless received names. Mercy, Council, Bridal, Lantern. Warheads were not their distinction. Brains were. Each one understood evasion as a language. Each one had practiced dance steps humans had learned from losing dogfights a century earlier and watching swarms of birds 1,000 years before that. Each one knew the morals of the mission. End what must end. Spare what can be spared, never flatter pride with messy heroics. Missiles away, Morales said, not aloud, but into the net that held more captains than she'd ever meet. Keep your ladders staggered, no target isolation, herd them out if they go, shatter lines if they stay. Down in North Star, Dr. Varzi tapped the charter on the wall as if to keep time with fate. Record everything, she told a boyish lieutenant. When this ends, the story will matter as much as the score. Because of courts, he asked. Because of children, she said. The missiles found the gaps any system has when built by people who believed no one would be rude enough to use them. They slid under shield lips, grinned against vents, and kissed communication arrays into silence. Those that faced a choice between a reactor and a rudder took the rudder first, because philosophy needs fuel and fuel needs time. A Vekri destroyer spun slowly, light strobing in confusion. Its guns kept seeking what they no longer understood how to find. Confirm human intent, Mare whispered, voice roughened by the wrong kind of respect. Their fire is not wild. It is arithmetic, Tal said. They studied us before we were interesting. Aegis quivered, the harmless kind of quiver that meant mass drivers talking to metal through structure. Morale's teeth clicked once. She thought of the day her mother had taught her to tap brakes on black ice, not because the car would obey, but because you would. Wisp squadrons at threshold, the choir breathed. Set them loose. Let's first show them we have manners, Morale said. She opened the wideband channel again. The words she spoke next were not threat, they were invitation to decency. Cynosure ships, you are losing, power down. Plot your departure vector. If you leave now, you will be escorted out. If you persist, you will be left without engines and then without air. Choose the living option. The answer was plasma. It came thick and angry, a cutlass swung at a surgeon. It vaporized 3 missiles and then clawed empty space where the 4th had been a breath ago. The 4th kissed a flagship's auxiliary bay and taught it humility. Tal felt the concussion as a memory of gravity. Enough pedagogy, he said, the old boredom returning like muscle memory. Return maximum, burn their little choir to ash. Aegis displays filled with incoming. Morales watched every icon with the fond, clinical detachment of someone who had worked triage before. All right, she said to nobody and to everyone. Let them meet the wisps. In the shadow lanes between planets where no law says up, shapes barely larger than a van lit their spines and wrote curves in the dark. The Wisp-class fighters did not look like weapons, they looked like questions. They rode the shaped wake of their own signatures, introduced noise into sensors like lies whispered at a bad time, and then arrived exactly where they needed to be, close enough to matter, far enough to leave. We don't joust, Morales reminded them. We don't gloat. If you can take their hands instead of their hearts, take the hands. Each wisp turned 4 tiny muzzles and sewed electromagnetic stitches through enemy life support trunks and comm manifolds. Lights went out in tidy strips. Hulls breathed hard and then carefully breathed again. Why? Mare demanded. Why do they spare breath? Tal understood because he had never bothered to value it. Because they are not killing us, he said, voice gone flat. They are arranging us. He did not yet know how much he was right. Humans do not worship metal for being metal. They worship the work metal can be taught to do. In the 3rd minute of the 1st hour of the only war that ever mattered to the people in it, the teaching reached an exam. The Wisp squadrons finished threading silence into comms. Stoneflower's 2nd salvo did not aim for dramatic kills. It aimed for helm authority, for the actuators that give weight to will. Dozens of Vekri ships lost the ability to point hatred in a straight line. Grav tripwires armed, whispered the choir, and a line of invisible minds too polite to be called minds woke along the retreat corridor the Dominion would choose because pride is a statistic. They were not explosives, they were lures. Change a ship's gravity by 5% at the wrong microsecond and you don't need to crack it. You let it crack itself against its own command of momentum. Tal watched his formation deform like a scolded flock. He could almost admire the audacity. The human network did not behave like a council. It behaved like an organism that had written a governance document for itself and then kept it. Individuated voices, shared mind. He had annihilated hives that were easier to scatter. On Aegis, Morales didn't smile. She had learned not to when lives were on the other side of the curve. Choir, begin shepherd posture, she said. Push them away from the lifelines. No debris toward Earth. Board if they stall, burn if they bite. Confirm boarding, asked a Wisp lead, surprise tucked in the professionalism. Confirm, Morales said. We prefer testimony to wreckage. Down in North Star, Dr. Varzi leaned closer to Reed's shoulder. Here's where our values will cost us seconds, she said. Worthy seconds, Reed replied. He had once taught at a community college where he'd learned that patience wasn't about time. It was about keeping a room together long enough to learn anything. The Dominion tried a brute answer. 15 ships burned their own forward hangars as makeshift torches, spraying incandescent plasma in a clumsy fan. The fan boiled 3 wisps that trusted physics a degree too far. Each pilot became a small gold star on a wall someone would visit on birthdays. Morale's voice did not change. We honor the dead with better math, she said. Wisp leader, shift your approach to blind cones. Keep them guessing about where their own hulls shadow their rage. The kinetic organs, the rail platforms disguised as weather friends, continued their unholy liturgy. They didn't fire rapidly, they fired inevitably. Every bolt that left a muzzle had a name and a path and a purpose written into it by a machine that sang to a human heart rate. A Vekri-heavy cruiser tried to put a planet between itself and a problem, and instead found that problems which fit between planets could be very patient. A dart arrived exactly where math promised it would and introduced the cruiser's spine to daylight. Particle Shear Online sang the choir with a thrill that wasn't pride. Permission? Actions only, Morales said. No thermal sweeping near any ship with a green breath signature. The green breath signature was the algorithm that guessed whether enemy life support still held. It was broken compassion imperfectly implemented. Imperfect compassion is still compassion. Out past Neptune, in a machine built inside an ice shell because the engineers liked good metaphors, 6 emitters woke. Particle beams that weren't beams in any simple sense lanced the dark like someone drawing a rule set in light. Where they touched Dominion hulls, atoms remembered they could be other atoms and momentarily forgot the point of cohesion. The effect wasn't slicing, it was gentlemanly disassembly. 3 ships fell into 2 ships each. 2 ships became 4 regrettable sculptures losing their pressure arguments with space. Stratego's mare finally put question to her fear. Marshal, their fire discipline is moral. Tal flicked his primary eyelid. Morality is a force multiplier when you can afford it, he said. We will make them pay for buying it. He picked 20 ships whose captains were better at rage than reason and speared them toward the moon's far side where the mass driver slept. He did not expect to kill the driver. He expected to drag human attention sideways by murdering a symbol. Choir chuckled, an audio artifact someone had added years ago because networks get lonely. They want the driver, the mesh said. Let's show them the other hand. From the shadow of the Earth's own shadow, hulls bigger than office buildings lost their paint. They stepped out of a stealth that wasn't magical. It was obsessive in detail. The harbor fleet had been asked to wait because the doctrine wanted to be sure its case would persuade even itself. Waiting time ended. 12 corvettes as blunt as hammers, 8 frigates like long knives, 2 cruisers that engineers called prayers because no one else would, and a carrier whose deck hands still named aircraft like pets flared identifiers for any eye that could afford to see. "Light M," Morales said softly. The corvettes did not join the fight by shooting. They joined it by shouting at physics, blooming microwave curtains that wrinkled sensors, laying spoofed gravwells like footprints headed nowhere, throwing up a blizzard of false contacts between real teeth. The frigates used that curtain to slide in close, ejecting canisters that stuck to Dominion hulls and wrote new operating systems on old Pride. In less than a minute, 5 Vekri captains reached for guns that now replied politely that they were not authorized users. On the flagship, Kersh Tal watched icons wink to gray. When he spoke, it was not with fury. It was with a simple, almost admiring fatigue. "We misread them," he said. "We did what we have always done, and so did they, but what they have always done is prepare." He could order a last gesture, fling everything hot at the blue planet, and demand a myth. He could die loud. He could live quiet. He chose neither yet. "All ships," he said, "begin withdrawal to safe distance. Reframe the fight later." The retreat corridor lit up with the polite minds. Half the withdrawing ships skated, wobbled, corrected. The other half found that 5% of gravity at the wrong time is a poem about humility. "Marshal," Mare said, her voice breaking into something younger, "if we stay, we die. If we turn, we die slower. If we talk, we change the subject," Tal said. "Open a line." The second conversation was shorter than the first. That happens after both sides have met each other's homework. "This is High Marshal Kersh Tal of the Cynosure Dominion," he said. He did not enlarge his image or pan across weapons. He left the camera where it was, which is a kind of bow. "We recognize your capacity." "This is Captain Alina Morales," she answered. She did not smile at the concession. She catalogued it. "State your intent." "Withdraw," Tal said. "Reconstitute, return with diplomats, or not at all." "You fired first," Morales said. "You don't get to schedule the ethics. Here are the options that keep your crews breathing. 1. Immediate departure along your entry vector, escorted and under inspection. 2. Power down and submit to boarding. We will treat prisoners under our law. 3. Persist and we will finish your engines and maybe your air. Choose." In North Star, Dr. Varzi lifted a hand at Reed. "Offer them a story," she said. Reed nodded and transmitted the packet that had been scrubbing through a dozen legal filters for 3 decades. It was a library more than a pamphlet. The charter text, the filming of first fire, timestamps that cared too much about honesty, histories of human restraint and human failures written without flattery, names of courts that had reviewed doctrines that someday would be called myths. There were even footnotes. Someone had once laughed about including footnotes in a war. They had included them anyway. "Your law is internal," Tal said after glancing at the first pages with the practiced contempt of a man who had made a career of reading treaties for loopholes. "It does not bind us. It binds us," Morales said, "which is why it matters." While words tried to do their slow, holy work, the fight continued in the way fights do when they've already been decided, and some actors haven't read ahead. A Dominion destroyer that had lost the discussion, but not the habit, peeled toward the mass driver and vomited a last guttering lance. A wisp slid across its nose, found the one place where heat would convince metal to fall in love with itself at the wrong angle, and folded the lance into the destroyer's forward cargo. Fire sat down where it should have been stored and taught a room about regret. Then pressure taught the room about silence. Morales didn't flinch. She had flinched enough in training to owe calm to the moment. "Marshal," she said, "pull your wolves back on the leash." Tal's hand did not hesitate. He cut into the command net with a code that turned mutiny into manners. The destroyer choked to a drift. "Thank you," Morales said, and meant it. Courtesy costs almost nothing when you have solved your logistics. "What happens if I choose boarding?" Tal asked. He was too old for theater now. You get coffee you will not like, Morales said, because humor is part of mercy. You get medical treatment. You get to tell your story on record. Your ships get cataloged, then broken down for study. Your crews go home when we finish making a point to the rest of the sky. What point? That we can be lived with, she said, and that we cannot be eaten. On Reed's floor, a tech signaled with 2 fingers, the old gesture for 2 minutes. The Harbor Fleet's second line, bigger ships with names politicians like to say into microphones, was almost ready to ease out of shadow. Doctrine wanted to show that the hammer you held back was heavier than the one you used. Deterrence is not cruelty, it is pedagogy and steel. Marshal, Morales said, keeping her voice even the way you keep a bridge level through surf. You have 90 seconds to commit to option 1 or 2. Past that, option 3 commits to you. Tal folded a set of secondary lids over his eyes, as Vekri do when they think about children. He had never sired any, he had never had time. He thought instead about the cadets who had followed him through victories he pretended not to count. He imagined them breathing green breath signatures on ships that shook with sudden absence. He could tell them to die bravely. He could tell them to live well. He could call home and offer a narrative that would get him tried, then executed, then footnoted. He could choose a word that would put history on a diagonal line toward something besides him. Captain Morales, he said, He didn't finish because 10 Wisp squadrons flared countermeasures in a coordinated bloom that looked, from the Dominion bridge, like a flower opening in reverse. For a heartbeat, everyone blinked at beauty. Then gravity in the retreat corridor hiccuped again, polite and devastating. The Harbor Fleet's lead cruiser stepped forward at last, not as a threat but as an example, showing what further insistence would meet. On its hull were painted words in 5 languages that had never agreed about very much. The words said, "Enter peacefully or be escorted out." The second line, smaller, said, "We will help you choose." Morales let the image occupy the space where arguments go to wither. Marshal. The pause stretched, not with fear now, but with arithmetic. Somewhere behind Tal, Stratego's mare whispered something private that he did not correct. He thought of law he did not believe in binding an enemy who did. "Captain," he said at last, choosing a humiliation that would not kill his crews, "open your harbor." Morales exhaled for the first time in she wasn't sure. "Aegis copies," she said. "All choir nodes shift to docking protocol, board with courtesy. Document with fidelity. Remember why we studied ethics." Down in North Star, Dr. Varzi closed her eyes and opened them again. "Now we teach," she said. "Not them, us." The harbor doctrine was never about proving humans could kill splendidly. It was about proving they could stop. Out beyond the frame, beyond Part 4 last line, diplomats would start writing verbs into nouns and making myths out of minutes. Old empires would read footage like an obituary drafted in a mirror, and children would someday be bored by this history, which is its truest victory. But in this hour, in this harbor, metal learned to pray, not to be forgiven, but to be precise in service of mercy. Boarding is not a brawl when you plan it for 60 years. It is a ceremony where both sides learn what they are trying to be. On the flagship, the lights had settled into a breathy green that meant someone else now had a say in who lived. High Marshal Kersh Tal stood in the gantry with his hands visible as he had been instructed. Behind him, crew in gray harnesses arranged themselves in rows, helmets unsealed, weapons absent by design and regret. The hatch erized open. The first human aboard was not a soldier. She was a medic. "Pressure equalized. You will feel a temperature shift," she said through the translator a Dominion linguist had bullied into coherence 3 minutes earlier. Her badge read Soto Harper. She looked smaller than the armor implied. She looked like the way hospitals felt in the hour before dawn, competence with the volume turned down. Behind her came the boarding officer, Lieutenant Jace Harlow, visor up so eyes could be a kind of handshake. "You are protected persons under our law," Harlow said, enunciating the script like a vow. "You will be searched for weapons and immediate hazards. You will not be harmed if you comply. Medical triage within 2 minutes. Records taken in your language in hours. The charter is posted in the corridor. If you cannot read it, we will read it to you. Stratego's mare's mandibles flexed in something like a laugh. You make war like a courthouse, she said. We try to make courts so we need less war, Harlow replied. Arms out, please. The search was ritual more than suspicion. A Vecri technician reached instinctively for a pocket where she kept a charm, a sliver of polished hull from her academy ship, and froze at Harlow's raised hand. Harlow nodded to Soto. The medic opened a clear pouch with gloved fingers. Personal items bag, she said, and waited until the charm settled in a safer place than superstition. Tall watched, cataloging. The human faces did not sneer. The hands did not shake. He had seen the other kind of boarding, vac suits patched with someone else's blood, boots on necks to make gravity of a different sort. This was not softness. This was administration under stress, which is one of civilization's better tricks. In the flagship's command amphitheater, Captain Alina Morales floated into view on a small screen. Hair pulled back. Expression set to the stillness she used when she didn't trust her voice to carry all the way across what needed carrying. Marshal Tall, she said, I will speak to you after your crews are secured and seen. Your wounded are our priority. You do not ask for their officers first? Tall said. He expected gloating. He received logistics. Rank matters less than pulse, Morales said. You'll find when we are done that our pride lies in the accounting, not the spectacle. On Earth, North Star walked its own ceremony. In the largest briefing room, Director Samuel Reed stood before a wall that was, for once, allowed to be theater. Footage of the battle tiled in quadrants. Beams stopped mid-journey, darts becoming law, fighters sowing quiet into violence. Dr. Amina Varzi stood beside him and didn't smile when she cued the next tile, a close mic of Morales reading the notice of imminent defense. We publish in full, Varzi said to the room. Everything, the warning, the time stamps, the restraint. We will blur faces of our own dead. We will not blur our doctrine. If the galaxy wants a story, it should take this one, complete with footnotes. Push to open channels, asked a comms tech. Push to everyone who will take it, Reed said, and to some who won't. Back aboard the flagship, Soto knelt by a Vecri gunner whose left breathing sac had glazed under flash heat. The medic's glove hummed with diagnostic while her voice hummed with something older. You're not dying, she told the gunner, because sometimes the truth is the most useful medicine. It's going to hurt less in 30 seconds. You will hate the taste in your mouth. That means the drug is working. You spare us to put us in cages, the gunner rasped, translator struggling with resentment and pain. We spare you because we are what we say, Soto replied, not looking up. The cage part is temporary and bureaucratic. Tall met Harlow's gaze over an improvised table that had been a munitions console 2 hours ago. Why coffee? The marshal asked. He held the thin cup carefully as if heat were an accusation. Harlow didn't perform a grin. Because it tastes like a decision, he said, and because hospitality stabilizes interrogations better than intimidation. We want accurate records, Marshal, not operas. Records of your mercy, Tall said. You will use them like weapons, and we will use them like mirrors, Harlow said. Weapons are for when mirrors fail. They processed 497 prisoners on the flagship alone. The numbers mattered in the way that lets a person sleep. Elsewhere, WISP pilots set their after-action markers on a memorial page. 3 new names. A technician in North Star printed the names in ink and taped them with steady hands to the charter frame. He did not know any of the pilots. That was not a requirement. In the interview room that had been a map closet, Dr. Varzi conducted the first long conversation with High Marshal Tall. There were 3 cameras, 2 translators, 1 pitcher of water that tasted of the station's filters. I'll be explicit, Varzi began, folding her hands as if she were about to deliver bad news kindly. We need your testimony to convict your empire in the court of everyone else's opinion. We also need you to hear us not as tormentors, but as a future neighbor. Those are separate needs. We will keep them separate. You believe in separation so strictly, Tall said. Law from force, mercy from victory. How do you not bleed the lines in a hurry? We do, Varzi said. History shows the stains. We learn to stop before the stain is all you can see. That's why we put the charter on the wall where the keys are. We want our hands embarrassed if they move wrong. You have footnotes, Tal said, a sound like dry amusement shaping his voice. Your civilization footnotes its war. We footnote to remember we didn't invent wisdom yesterday, Varzi said, to show our children where to look when they ask why we did it this way. The door chimed. Morales took Varzi's place without formalities. Her time was rationed in minutes that already belonged to the dead. Marshal, the captain said, we will repatriate you eventually, not today. Today we need to be certain no one is hiding a last shot in a duct. You will send me home to be punished by my own, Tal said. We will send you home to be useful, Morales corrected. Punishment is their habit. Usefulness is your choice. Stratego's mayor requested assignment with the prisoners to surface labor, citing tradition. Morales counteroffered a different kind of labor. I need a liaison to teach my analysts where our assumptions are lazy, she told Mayor. You speak like an officer, but watch like an engineer. Help us map your doctrine so we don't get surprised by a different empire that learned from yours. Mayor stared a long beat. You do not fear we will corrupt you. We fear laziness more, Morales said. Corruption has tells, laziness wears a smile. Later, when the flagship's engines wound down under human authority, and the last wisp peeled away from escort to refuel at a stoneflower kennel, Morales floated alone in the viewport bubble. Below, the Earth spilled clouds over continents that had conducted this war like a committee brave enough to be dull. She stole 1 minute that did not belong to her and let her forehead rest against the glass. We did not fire first, she whispered to the room. We did not fire second without warning. We struck to end. We held. The harbor doctrine had survived its first real hour. Now it had to survive the first real after. The message packet left Aegis on a dozen carriers and 1,000 relays, some legal, some less so. It lit up the relay economies of merchant guilds who loved to pretend that neutrality was a business model. It arrived at listening posts that had spent centuries tasting radio noise like gossip. It leaked into places that governments called unhelpful and citizens called the good parts of the net. It was long, it was complete, and it was so boring that no one could accuse it of propaganda. Boring is how you smuggle truth past cynicism. The footage showed the Dominion firing first. It showed the charter notice. It showed the 30 heartbeats counted, the shields failing to math, the fighters sewing, the particle shears operating under rules that refused to be drama when restraint would do. It showed medics first through hatches and coffee offered without asking permission from Pride. It showed Captain Alina Morales speaking like a person who had learned how to be a symbol without liking the taste. The packet contained the charter with its 4 lines and all its footnotes. It contained, appended, a reading list that would end the career of any propagandist who tried to sell humans as angels. By the 3rd day, an anthill world called Isle lit its sky with small ships painted in home-proud colors. They do not have navies, the registry databases had said for generations. The databases were correct until the minute they weren't. Isle's pilots trained in a canyon that scribed a narrow blue through green hills. They flew a course named for a river that had flooded 5 times in recorded memory and given the world 5 different reasons to learn to build higher. At the end of the week, a courier brought them quiet net seed boxes in crates that claimed to be medical refrigerators. The crates were not lying. Quiet saves lives. On a moonlet with more metal than gravity, a race called the Tzai who had taught their young to duel with knives that vibrated like bees watched the human footage in a theater with no chairs. The Tzai were very good at losing beautifully. Let's try winning quietly, their eldest said, and ordered their knives put on a museum wall, and their minds put into simulation rooms where wisp pilots with patient voices ran them through drills that punished heroism and priced survival cheap. North Star became a school with long-distance tuition. Reed named the program Harbor Schools because he disliked cleverness in letters that would go to grieving parents someday. Doctor, Varzi drew up the ethics curriculum. It required every trainee, human and not, to study last-century scandals where good intentions put blood on uniforms. It made them recite the charter before they signed out a single warhead. It made them rehearse mercy like they rehearsed checklists. Competence is a mercy. Morales did not teach. She wrote the foreword to the manual in a voice edited to remove the parts where she wanted to make jokes about bureaucracy to comfort teenagers. Then she went back to the viewport and counted spent burn flares that looked like falling stars. "We will not let this become a religion," she told Reed on a private channel. "Religions are very good at forgiving themselves." "We'll make it a policy," Reed said. "Policies can be voted out." In detention, Bays painted the color of waiting. High Marshal Tall earned a reputation for being useful. He explained how Dominion Fleet doctrine assumed certain delays in adversary command loops and how Quiet Net made those assumptions lethal. He showed a harbor school cohort where Vecri hulls carried the equivalent of tendons and how to disable them without collapsing lungs. He taught them the phrases a Vecri officer would use when his pride had been cornered, and what answer would preserve lives instead of starting a second fight in a room full of medics. He did this partly out of professional vanity and partly because he had been offered what humans called a plea. Usefulness would cut the length of humiliation in half. Strategos Mare, assigned as liaison to the analysis cell, became a favorite because she did not flatter. When a WISP instructor praised a trainee's beautiful turn, Mare said, blunt as a wrench, "Beauty is not in your job description." When a policy writer suggested a poetic line for the charter preamble, Mare pointed at the 4 lines that mattered and said, "Poetry wastes seconds." On the 9th day, Dr. Varzi walked into the interview room with a folder she did not hand to Tal immediately. "You're going home," she said. He had expected a year. He had budgeted for 2. "Home to what?" "To carry a message," Varzi said, "and to stand in a room that will hate you for saving them. Before you argue, hear the plan." The plan was not generous. Humans would release 1 Dominion corvette into Tal's command, with Vecri crew drawn from those least likely to torch the ship out of spite and most likely to value air. The corvette would be inspected, rigged with a quiet net leash that Tal could feel but not cut, and sent along a corridor that humans had mapped with the same attention they gave to emergency lanes through freeway wrecks. At 3 points, coalition ships, no longer a phrase said with tongue-in-cheek, would step out of quiet to drink coffee and exchange signatures, proving they could have stopped the corvette but did not. The message would be the trip itself. "What if my High Council declares this a trick and fires on your escorts?" Tal asked. "They'll be out of range before the Council finishes composing the speech," Varzi said. "We are betting on your bureaucracy's love of words." "What if I defect?" he asked, curious if honesty would be rewarded with respect or dodged with platitudes. "You may," Varzi said. "We will take you, but we prefer you go. It's easier to change an empire if the warnings come from its own throat." Morales briefed the escort captains on a secure loop. "We do not posture," she said. "We do not trail within grievance distance. We display, think parade, not hunt." "Paint the message," one captain said, and there was rue in his voice, the name of a WISP pilot who had not finished his 3rd month with the squadron. "We paint the message," Morales said, "and we hold the line on not becoming the thing we hate." The corvette launch felt like sending a child to a school where the teachers wore knives. Tal took his chair and wrapped fingers that had signed orders for annihilation around a grip meant for subtler work. Strategos Mare stood at his shoulder, neither defiant nor docile. "If home kills you, will you be pleased to have been right about something?" she asked. "If home kills me, I will be angry to miss the next lesson," Tal said. The escort stepped into view at intervals like commas written by a careful hand. Each showed its hull words: "Enter peacefully or be escorted out." Each flashed the second line: "We will help you choose." None made the mistake of being theatrical about it. Deterrence works best when you speak as if you are describing the weather. By the time the corvette crossed into the space that maps insisted was Cynosure's idea of civilization, half a dozen worlds had sent small delegations to Aegis asking how much a harbor school would cost. The answer was not money. The answer was signatures, on the charter, on rules of evidence, on an agreement to broadcast warnings in full before anyone sent a missile anywhere. Several leaders balked. "We cannot be bound," one said. "You already are," Dr. Varzi replied. "By gravity and audience, we're just asking you to write it down. Publishing the sky is not about posting videos. It is about making the sky care who watches." The coalition did not yet have a name. Journalists began to call it the Free Harbors. The name stuck because someone made a logo that fit on a pilot's sleeve without getting in the way of buckles. Cynosure Prime was the kind of capital that thinks it invented corridors. Tal had marched them as a cadet when he still believed that carpet color could approximate virtue. Now he watched the guards pretend their rifles were old friends rather than recent confidences. The corridors smelled like legal stenographers, the smell of a room where no one has bled. The High Council sat on chairs shaped by centuries of successful speeches. They liked to call the Dominion a constellation of order. They liked to call rebellions weather. Their faces were the same faces that had looked from wall screens when Tal received his first star, confident, humorless, hygienic. "You acted without orders," the first voice said after the pageant of welcomes that did not welcome. "You engaged a primitive without sanction. You endangered the balance." "I engaged a sovereign with a fleet the council assigned me," Tal said. He did not perform contrition. He performed nouns and verbs. "The sovereign defended. Our doctrine failed. I chose to save crews rather than not." "You surrendered," the second voice said, and the word tasted sweet to mouths trained on triumph. "I preserved assets of the Dominion, lives," Tal said, "in accordance with the law you recite when you answer petitions from widows." "Do not teach us law," the third voice said, and the guards' rifles remembered what they were. Stratego's mare stood to the side under a camera that pretended to be a safe fixture. She had agreed to stand because humans had asked her what she wanted to be. She was not yet sure of the answer, which made her dangerous in a different way than before. "The humans' footage is manipulated," the fourth voice said, waving a hand. "They have cut frames, they have resized facts, they claim they did not fire first because they control the angles." Tal lifted a recorder. "Angles cannot invent your own beam," he said. The recorder played 10 seconds of Cynosure plasma sculpting rage and accuracy, annotated with math. Tal had memorized the angles. He could taste the coordinates behind his teeth. "You would conspire with enemies," the second voice said. "For fame. For breath," Tal said. The session recessed under the pretense of consensus building. In the corridor built for two kinds of footsteps, slaves and those who timed them. An officer Tal had once trained stepped close enough that her breath made a pretense of whisper. "They're going to arrest you for treason," she said. "They have to. Your survival makes their pride contagious." "Will you testify?" Tal asked, already knowing that asking might make her useless. "I will remember your choices at my own trial," she said, and left through a door that smelled like promotions. The arrest came with choreography designed to comfort the council and frighten the hallway. Two guards, rifles level. Words stand, spoken as if they had not pressed the word on children practicing parades. Stratego's mare moved before she decided to. Her palm found the guard's weapon near the center of gravity and tilted it into the floor with the same courtesy she had once used to pour wine. "We do ceremony," she said. "We do not do theater." "Stand down," the guard hissed, which is a phrase that means nothing to a soldier who has decided what she is. Mare kept the rifle pointed at a place with no lives in it. "Marshal Tal is under harbor protection until the charter's accountants are done with him," Mare said. "You will wait for a summons. You will bring a better pen." The corridor filled with the kind of silence that makes headlines. Headlines appeared. Outside, not yet in range of anything but cameras. 3 coalition frigates painted their hull words in tighter fonts, the better to fit in the frame. while floating in a posture that courts would call lawful presence and admirals would call a lesson. They were not there to rescue. They were there so that when the council wrote its script, it would hear itself echo and get bored. The council did not love boredom. It loved spectacle. It announced a public hearing. It draped banners that had covered so many other disappointments. It invited foreign observers to prove it had nothing to hide. It wrote the questions before it read the answers. Human representatives did not attend. Dr. Varzi sent a video of herself at a table with stacks of transcripts and a mug that said, "Please cite sources." "We will not turn your trial into our stage," she said. "We will submit exhibits. We will watch. We will remember." The trial became an education by accident. Dominion citizens who had never seen footage not curated like a garden saw a wisp nose camera view of a boarding that looked like a clinic. Engineers noticed the thermal limits on the human mass drivers and started filing memos with subject lines like, "Why don't we have one?" The quartermasters ran numbers on the cost of losing 57 ships in 4 minutes and stopped laughing at the charter as a quaint religion. Mothers who had been told their sons died in honor heard the 30 heartbeats counted and did not hear their boys in that counting. The court stenographer, trained to neutralize tone into transcript, wrote the words "we will help you choose" and chose to copy them twice. Somewhere two jumps away. A Dominion Commodore who had not received instructions in time decided doctrine was an ingredient rather than a meal. He gathered 8 ships and marched them toward a colony that had sent a letter of interest to the harbor schools. The Commodore wanted to remind history that it obeyed him. The coalition frigates near Cynosure Prime did nothing. The coalition corvettes in that colony's shadow did everything. They presented the Commodore with the words on their hulls and a math problem. He solved the problem wrong. He returned home in 6 pieces of ship and a full complement of breathing crew who were very angry about being alive and very alive about being angry. The High Council's hearing stumbled forward. It found Tall guilty of embarrassing an empire. It sentenced him to an exile that thought it was a kindness and was in fact a microphone. Assignment to an outpost that had always been a rumor with a view of a corridor where coalition ships made parades without music. "You will rot looking at them," the first voice said. "I will teach children how not to die," Tall said. Stratego's mare took neither sentence. She filed papers in triplicate, as the Dominion loved, requesting resignation from a service she had bled for. She cited religious reasons. The religion was truth. The council denied the request on the grounds that religion, like the press, was an indulgence for peacetime. Mare folded the denial into a paper ship and sailed it into a fountain where a statue thought it was Neptune. At night, under a sky that had forgotten how to be dark, Dominion citizens watched coalition broadcasts that were supposed to be blocked and found themselves interested in boring things. Procurement hearings where wisp hulls were debated with more passion than poems. Classroom footage where harbor schools made small cadets recite the charter before eating. Boredom is contagious when it saves your children. The council issued an edict. No ship may broadcast the words "enter peacefully" or be escorted out. The next morning, graffiti in that exact phrasing appeared on 400 hulls, painted by deckhands who had discovered that slogans are easy to stencil and harder to erase. Audience with an empire is not the same as conversion. It is a long meeting where one side pretends fatigue is victory and the other side arranges the coffee. The coalition kept arranging the coffee. Someone printed mugs that said collateral under 1%, and someone else said maybe we shouldn't put that on merchandise. They didn't. 6 months is a generous word in space. It fit the time between the battle and the day a procession of unremarkable transports, escorted by ships without guns, threaded through a corridor chalked on star charts in a handwriting that was starting to look familiar. The transports were not carrying weapons. They carried teachers, engineers, medics, and bureaucrats with gospels of forms. Nothing terrifies empires more efficiently than paperwork that works. The coalition acquired a name it could live with, the Constellation of Free Harbors. It came with a flag that looked good at distance and unremarkable up close, the right ratio for a symbol. The charter lived on the inside of airlocks and the backs of training manuals and the screens of small ships where fingers absently tapped it like a prayer. The 4 lines did not grow longer. People have a way of adding flourishes to doctrines until they own them more than obey them. The charter stayed short because Dr. Varzi threw away additions with the same tenderness she used to hand out scholarships. Captain Alina Morales did not become a politician. She kissed a memorial wall with 3 gold stars on a day when a reporter waited too long to ask her a question and got silence for copy. She turned down a promotion that would have moved her desk farther from windows and accepted a different burden. She trained captains to be boring on purpose. "The galaxy already has enough heroes," she told them. "Be a clerk with good aim." In a gym where the floor had learned to fake gravity well enough for laughter, WISP pilots taught older people from other species how to lose less beautifully. They ran a drill called Choose the Living Option, where trainees had to pick between an elegant kill and a clumsy disable, while a clock counted down the way heartbeats do when someone you love is 3 systems away. Fail the drill, and you read stories about villages that did not get hit because a pilot was rude to beauty. On Cynosier's edge, the outpost that had been Tal's exile turned into an office. He answered letters from midshipmen for whom the words "enter peacefully" had become the kind of dare that saves lives. He wrote a manual on humility disguised as readiness and dedicated it to Stratego's mare because dedications are how contrition does something besides spin in place. He did not know if she read it. He hoped she threw it away angrily, which would be reading. Sometimes, on clear nights when the Dominion's net forgot to notice small things, coalition ships made slow passes, not close enough to provoke, close enough to be visible to children with binoculars. They did not dump leaflets. They did not play music. They did not draw hearts with contrails. They kept station and let the words on their hulls do their gravity. Of all the inventions of this era, the most effective might have been font choice. The Constellation learned after-action humility the hard way. In a system with 3 suns and a patience for drought, a harbor school graduate misread a malicious gesture and fired second without giving a full notice. The colonists survived because the militia's guns were old and the wind was kind. The graduate resigned. He donated his pension to a scholarship fund named after the people who had to rebuild a granary. Dr. Varzi added a footnote to the charter commentary. "When we fail, we confess with the same volume we used for victory." The footnote was quoted more often than the original line, which is a different kind of victory. Morales visited North Star less as a captain than as a pilgrim to the place where a doctrine became more than a file name. She found Reed asleep at a desk under a light that had died in a way that made the room hospitable. "We're not done," she said, which is a curse and a blessing. "We're not supposed to be," Reed said, rubbing eyes that had watched too much footage to believe in endings. On a world of wind, bells, and libraries, a girl wrote an essay for a class called Civic Engineering. She described the harbor doctrine in words that belonged to a teenager with more hope than scars. "It says don't start fights," she wrote. "And if someone starts one, end it so fast the lesson doesn't need a sequel. It says know your law by heart and your hardware by serial number. It says write short rules so you can remember them when you're scared. It says if you have to hurt, hurt once and correctly and then stop. It says publish everything so lies have nowhere to grow. It says metal can learn to pray if we teach it." The teacher wrote in the margin, "Find a less pretty way to say pray." The girl crossed out nothing and added, "Okay, program metal with mercy." High Marshal Kershtal, no longer high, sometimes watched the coalition feeds while pretending to check weather in corridors that did not have weather. He kept a file labeled Future on a private slate that no one would inherit. It contained a letter he never sent to Morales. The first line said, "You did not humiliate me. You humiliated what I was proud of, and I needed that more." The second line said, When we meet as neighbors, I will bring coffee and you will hate it. The third line was blank because sentences that end books deserve a place to land. On Aegis, a new hull came out of shadow for the first time with paint still soft at the edges and crew still learning where the quiet parts of the ship made their own wind. The words on the hull were there because they had to be, and because people had begun to use them on t-shirts and doorways and stamped into coins teenagers flipped for luck. Enter peacefully or be escorted out, and beneath, we will help you choose. Below the second line, in smaller type that required you to come close, someone had added 4 words with a stencil and a hand that knew how to measure. We mean the after, too. Captain Alina Morales watched the new ship take its first slow arc and felt, not pride, but the relief that comes when the plan you wrote on a bad day survives a good one. She remembered her civics teacher and the law you can live with the day after you win. She remembered the 3 names on the wall and the pilot named Rue who had not seen what this paint would look like in sun. She remembered Dr. Varzi tapping the charter frame to keep time with fate and Soto's glove humming next to a Vecri gunner's skin. "Choir," Morales said softly, and the net answered like a friend leaning close in a crowded room. "Log this as a doctrine check." "Go," the choir said, and if networks could smile without being creepy, it did. "We did not build a hammer," Morales said. "We built a harbor. Keep counting heartbeats. Keep everything boring until the minute it has to be beautiful. Publish the sky. And when the sky answers, record the after." The net echoed her message into places doctrine could not reach and policy hoped to. In a city whose curators ranked sculptures by how much they could bother a tyrant, someone carved 4 lines into stone. Children touched the letters the way you touch a pet you trust. Far away in a corridor that forgot darkness, a board guard traced the phrase, "We will help you choose," under his breath and found he liked how it felt in his mouth. Metal prayed without knowing it, not for forgiveness, for precision in service of mercy. The galaxy did not become kind. It became honest about what it admired. And when predators tried to teach the old lesson again, harbors offered the test on paper and steel. The charter was a map now. The map said, "Enter peacefully. If you cannot, we will help you practice. If you will not, we will end it quickly and then publish what we did so that next time you choose better." That is all. That is everything.